delve into how to create a sustainable water future in an ever-drier world. Now, I know today especially there are a lot of other issues to secure your attention. That's even more the case, not least with the coronavirus, and for those of you looking at the financial markets, the crash that's hit oil prices, interest rates, credit, stock markets, and probably everything else today. So I'm Anthony Curry. I'm Associate Editor with Breaking Views, which for those of you who don't know is Reuters' in-house financial commentary service. We're journalists who write what we hope are smart, pithy, financially savvy opinion pieces, setting the agenda in the realms of economics, capital markets, mergers and the like. Now, I've in my 15 years here covered most of these topics while also focusing on beats like Wall Street and car companies. But over the past several years, I've helped drive our push to cover climate change and sustainability, with water being my particular area of interest. And that's why I'm so glad we've gathered a fantastic trio of speakers for today's webinar. And they do complement each other very well, offering a mix of new hard data, on-the-ground experience, and investment nous. So later on, you'll hear from Andrew Lee, who's Head of Sustainable and Impact Investing at UBS Global Wealth Management, a firm that manages some 2.6 trillion of assets. His team recently identified water scarcity as one of its most investable themes for the coming decade. And many of you doubtless know or have heard of Meena Ghuli. For those who haven't, she's the CEO of Thirst, which is a grassroots education and innovation organization, and is a tireless advocate for water issues, literally having turned marathon running into a way to raise awareness about water security, including last year's Running Dry campaign to run 100 marathons in 100 days. And I rather get the impression she's got more up her sleeve, so to speak. We start, though, with what has brought us all together, the crucial new report the World Resources Institute recently published, entitled Achieving Abundance, Understanding the Cost of a Sustainable Water Future. There's a link to the paper both in the webinar invite as well as on the final slide of our deck today, in case you're one of the few people who hasn't yet read it. Colin Strong from WRI is here to talk us through the findings, including startling new information on just how big the supply-demand gap is getting. Spoiler, it's far worse than the 40% number we've all been citing for a decade or more. He also talks about how much more money is needed for which aspect of water security and where. It's an incredibly timely, important, and useful tool. So Colin, over to you.
Thanks, Anthony. So just a quick, we're just going to dive right into it, but I'm going to start off with a quick review of what are different types of water challenges we can face, and this will lead us into the publication in the data set. So just a quick review for those of you who aren't already completely in the know here. The UN has outlined 6 different types of targets that fall beneath the Sustainable Development Goals for water. Sustainable Development Goals are basically just a way for countries and businesses to try to deliver sustainable development. The 6 targets that relate to water are: 1, delivering universal access to safe and affordable drinking water; 2, again, universal access to sanitation and hygiene. It's basically toilets and hand washing services. So those are collectively what's known as WASH, water access, sanitation, and hygiene. The 3rd one is on water pollution. Water pollution focusing on reducing untreated wastewater and minimizing hazardous or industrial waste. The 4th one is on water scarcity. Water scarcity, basically just delivering supply to people that have enough water to whether develop livelihoods or economies. So water scarcity is the 4th one, and this is a big one that we're going to come back to. 5th one is integrated water resources management. This is more of the regulatory approach to managing water. You can think of it utilities, regional basin authorities, transboundary agreements surrounding water. And the 6th one is on water-related ecosystems. So this is, of course, mountains, forests, wetlands, rivers, lakes. It's hard to think of an ecosystem that's not water-related. I do a review of this because we took this framing and we said, look, we have these types of targets that we want to achieve. Well, our question is, great, we know what these targets are. What does it actually take to achieve these from a cost of action perspective? So everything that we're talking about moving forward is one pathway to achieve these targets. We did slightly modify the targets, but that's all in the report. We don't need to go into the details here. And the other emphasis is that this is one pathway. It's possible to beat our numbers. It's possible to do worse than our numbers. But in general, this is the cost of action to deliver sustainable water management for the world, and you can break it down by the world, by countries, by major basins. And then you can look at each different type of water-related issue and the cost associated. So we'll jump right into the big numbers. What we calculate is 1 trillion annually from a base year of 2015 through 2030. And that is broken down into 5 different categories. So on the left here, you have a table that's just showing the cost respectively. On the right, the pie chart's a little more useful. This shows us what is the cost relative to other costs. So this trillion gets broken down. The big number comes out is water scarcity. That's 43% of that cost, at 445 billion. Again, this is for the world. So water scarcity is clearly our biggest driving factor from a cost perspective. That's because of the magnitude of the issue, and the solutions tend to cost a lot to resolve that issue. But that said, none of these issues are really small. Access to drinking water and access to sanitation, these are things that receive a lot of attention. They're still significant numbers, 11 and 14% respectively. Water pollution, that's 15% for industrial and agricultural pollution combined. If you want to see the industrial and agricultural, oh, sorry. I'll move a little closer to the mic. And so for water pollution, that's industrial and agricultural pollution. It's not domestic pollution. That's categorized beneath access to sanitation services. And if you want to see the breakdown between industrial and agricultural, feel free to just pull down the report and you can pull out those numbers individually. And then water management. This is a very traditionally under-recognized and underfunded aspect of sustainable water management as a whole. So this we have at 17%. One thing you'll notice is ecosystems is not in this pie chart. That's because ecosystems sits beneath every other category. For example, in resolving water scarcity, one of the things we calculate is how do you ensure that ecosystems also receive the necessary amount of water resources. Likewise, reducing agricultural pollution also has benefits from a eutrophication perspective. So while that pie chart was for the world and scarcity was the biggest driving factor, it's important for us to remember that water challenges tend to present themselves locally. So that cost profile is going to look very different for every country or every region. This is a quick regional focus, which shows us that that East Asia and the Pacific and North America have the largest amount of that cost. So that means the biggest investments need to be made in East Asia and North Pacific. And if you look at the yellow bar that tends to show up on these charts, this yellow bar is the water scarcity bar. So again, water scarcity is the driving factor here. As you get farther down, a common surprise people hear when people see this chart is the Middle East and North Africa is one of the smallest costs. That's mostly a population driver. Per capita, it's much more, the costs are pretty high, but from an absolute investment perspective, right, that still shows up fairly low. Other things that we see is sub-Saharan Africa has much higher access to drinking water and sanitation services than other places, but much lower scarcity costs. And then both Europe and Central Asia and also Latin America and Caribbean have very high pollution-related costs, as well as East Asia and the Pacific. So we don't need to dive too much into this chart, but this basically the information that we want to get from this is that while this global pie chart, and particularly that 43% cost water scarcity number, are definitely high priorities, what this profile actually looks like for every country or every region really varies. And that's the way that I think this is a useful way to communicate for a national government level or investing within one national economy. On the other hand, though, we can say, let's just back off. We said it's $1 trillion is about 1.2% of global GDP. As we get closer to 2030, that's probably going to be closer to 1% of GDP. That said, 1% or 1.2% of GDP is a fairly reasonable amount of money you could think to devote to something as fundamental as water resources. But that 1% is not distributed evenly across countries. So there's 75 countries that can deliver sustainable water management for under 2% of their GDP. And those countries tend to be countries in Europe, countries in North America. We see China is showing up on the map here. So basically anything in the light green here is a country that can achieve things for under 2% or even under 1%, the cost that we laid out. And then as you get above 2%, you get to 4 and even higher for some countries, 5, 6 and higher. And that's as the cost to deliver sustainable water management as a whole relative to your national GDP. These countries that show up in the dark red, the short answer is that they're not going to be able to deliver fully under their own national resources, which means they're going to require some sort of outside investment. On the other hand, those 75 countries that I mentioned that can deliver sustainable water management for under 2% of GDP, they can potentially achieve that within their own national resources. And the good news, there's not always a lot of good news, but the good news here is that those 75 countries represent 56% of the world's population. So that's a fairly significant number of the world that can hopefully achieve things within their own national budget. So one of the things though, I wanted to come back to scarcity. Scarcity is really the biggest driving cost for the largest countries. It's the biggest driving cost for the regions with the highest costs, and it's the biggest global cost. The reason that we come back to scarcity is because of two things. First of all, there's the magnitude of the issue. One of the things that Anthony referenced was that formerly that there was a 40% number in terms of 40% of the gap. Based upon the data that we have used for this working paper, that number is actually now at 56%. The change in that number from 40% to 56% is not we got farther from the goalposts. It's that we now have a lot better information than we did a decade ago when that 40% number was created. That's the short answer. That now we've identified it at 56% because we have better information, better hydrological models, and also better information on future demand. Future demand is we have higher degrees of future demand than we previously estimated. So that's another factor driving this. So one of the things though is while we're unpacking this scarcity as one of the major water challenges, first of all, there's the magnitude of the issue. That's the gap. If we look at the chart on the left here, this is how much each sector can deliver in closing the water scarcity gap globally. So what this means, so this is broken down in terms of a percentage, but the percentage is of a volume. This is the volume of water sectors can deliver. So what we see is that agricultural sector can really deliver the vast majority of water savings that can get us to a place where we are comfortable with water scarcity. That doesn't mean there's no one else has a role to play. Industrial and domestic can still deliver important water saving solutions, and also there is a component of supply side infrastructure in delivering the necessary water savings, but mostly 73% of that savings can come from the agricultural sector. So that's in terms of the magnitude of the gap and what should we be focusing on. Really, agriculture is one of the places where we can make a huge dent. But if we switch over to the right side of this slide, we can see the costs. So one of the things that here is that while the agricultural sector may be delivering the most in terms of water, it's not actually the highest cost. The highest cost comes from the industrial sector. So the reason for this is that the solutions associated with industrial water savings, whether it's industrial water reuse or certain types of increased efficiencies within manufacturing processes, these solutions tend to be really expensive, which is why our industrial costs tend to be really high. On the other end though, agriculture tends to be by far the most cost-effective solutions. So while the magnitude of the issue is very large within agriculture, the costs to deliver, say, drip irrigation and the scale at which drip irrigation can yield major water savings is actually very high. So agriculture tends to be some of the most cost-effective solutions. Domestic still in there around 10% in terms of costs, and that is still, I would say, more cost-effective, generally speaking, than a lot of industrial solutions. And then supply side costs are relatively small because it's a relatively small portion of the water saving solutions. So this is just a really quick highlight of water scarcity. I don't want to go into all the technical information in the publication because this is just a quick deep dive into water scarcity. But if you want to pull this out for any of the specific categories that have been shown earlier, you can feel free to pull up the working paper or and look into it there. So the main thing, though, I think I would like to take this and use this to sort of tee up conversations for our next panelists. One thing is that, and I think that Mina might speak more on this, is that we've just presented from the WRI side of things a lot of global numbers and national numbers that I think communicate the nature of the issue, and also I think both communicate the fact that, one, we need to devote more resources to these issues, but two, if we devote more resources to these issues, many of them, many water-related challenges may be solved. But I think it would be useful if we try and translate these high-level numbers into something that's more, into something that's a little more tangible. So that's a question that I have for Mina. Also, a question that I'll kind of push down the line that I'd ask to Andrew is this $1 trillion number that we've come up with. I mentioned that this number is one pathway to achieve sustainable water management. If we're really smart about focusing on the right solutions, we can actually beat that $1 trillion number while still achieving this. And on the other hand, if we're not smart about the way we choose effective solutions, we can spend $1 trillion annually and not make a dent. So I guess my question that I passed down the line for Andrew is, how do we make sure that we're finding and investing in the most effective solutions? I've started to get into here with focusing on agriculture, but I think that's a big conversation to make sure that we really deliver upon actual tangible benefits in a cost-effective way. All right, so I'll stop and pass it back to you, Anthony, and let you determine how we go forward.
Great, thank you, Colin. It's a great run through of the report. Certainly, I think we'll get back to some of those points, especially on that the deep dive on your final slide in the Q&A. And by the way, guys, you may all submit any questions you like in the app. I think some of you already are. And yes, I think we will be providing the slides afterwards just to answer the first question I see there. So let's move on to Mina Gooley. Mina is joining us from Melbourne in Australia, where it is currently 20 past midnight. So Mina, first of all, thank you very much for staying up. I assume you're staying up rather than just getting up early. And over to you. I know you've obviously been on the ground there during the wildfires, as well as the preceding long-term scarcity. And of course, I think you've been, as you joked to us the other day, you've been basically wearing a snorkel for the past week or two as the rains have come. So you've basically been experiencing everything apart from a swarm of locusts, I think. So why don't you just talk us through how you're coming at water scarcity as an issue in general, and then how things look on the ground around the world where you've seen them when running, and also obviously what's going on in Australia.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Yes, it's late or early, I'm not quite sure which, but it's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about this issue. What I actually wanted to do was to spend a bit of time looking, not only talking about these big numbers on a page, which I think can feel very dissociated from all of us. There are a lot of global problems around. There are competing challenges. You mentioned a couple of them when we were starting off this call, and there are issues which are commanding attention everywhere, in boardrooms, in investment committee meetings, in policy discussions. Most of the people on this call will be sitting there thinking, well, I've got 1,000 other things on my plate. Why should I care about water? And what are the opportunities for me in actually making change or making investments or yielding some benefit from the water discussions? I wanted to just really spend a few minutes talking about why some of these trends that Colin has talked about matter, not only to the people that are affected by water scarcity, but to all of us, because I think putting into context is incredibly important. And even before we get there, I want to give this water crisis a face. This is not just numbers on a page. This is the lives of real people in real places around the world. Now, let's see if I can actually make these slides move forward. Okay, so the water crisis, I think, affects all of us everywhere in places and ways that we cannot possibly imagine. I've had the immense honour and privilege of having seen this at the front line in places all around the world. One of the days that we spent in South Africa, we went and handed out water bottles to kids like this who'd stayed home from school in a place called Beaufort West in South Africa, where the people wait for water trucks to deliver water bottles. Kids don't go to school. Instead, they stay home waiting for these bottles to be delivered. We witnessed fights break out on the street as people fought over the remaining bottles left on the truck. This is life in a city that has run out of water. Okay. Sorry, I'm not very good at this tech situation. Okay. Okay. I can run long distances, but running tech, apparently, not my strong suit. Okay. In big cities like Chennai, Cape Town, they're also feeling it. This is not just a problem for small cities, it's for big ones too. Last year in Chennai, which is India's biggest city, they ran out of water completely. Buildings in town closed down because without water, there was no sanitation. And instead of going to work, people lined up in the streets to collect water that was brought in by train. In my home country in Australia, which we've talked about, we know absolutely what water scarcity looks like. We are the driest inhabited continent on the planet. And in towns like this one in Walgett, Australia, water has completely run out. For sale signs litter the streets, and even businesses like the local store, which has incredibly strong revenue lines, can't find buyers because without water, there's no future. This is not a single city problem for places like Walgett. There are 55 cities across Australia that are about to or have run dry. Yeah, 55. This is not a small problem, it's not a big problem, it's an everyone, everywhere problem. When towns and communities run dry, the impact isn't just felt at our taps, it's widespread. In Australia, we've had one of the hottest and driest periods on record. Farmers have lost stock, crops have not been planted, and rural communities across the country have been hurt incredibly badly. As many of you know, and you will have seen in the newspapers and online, Australia this year has been on fire. We've had the driest year on record. We've had the hottest year on record. In fact, if you look at the temperatures, they've been on average more than 1.5 degrees above normal, and rainfall has been more than 40% less than the average amount we've had. Weather patterns have wicked rain up to Indonesia, where it's fallen in floods. And instead of having wet, nice ground, we've had dry plant matter, which has meant that lightning has ignited hundreds of fires across the nation. We watched as over 1 billion animals died, hundreds of homes were lost, and communities have been devastated as fires have destroyed an area of land greater than the whole of Belgium, or 5 times the amount of land as that was destroyed in the Amazon. What's really important to us now is, now that we have overcome that first wave of problem and the devastation, is understanding the economic impact first of the drought and now of fire. And it's become very, very clear to all of us here that the impact of these fires will last for years or probably for decades. We have reduced plant cover, which was decreasing the natural ability of green infrastructure to filter water and to boost the water supply, and the flame retardants that have been used on the fires are now actually washing right out and contaminating the water bodies alongside the sediment and soot that's been washed off the ground. We've been hit by the real impact of water scarcity, and the environmental, societal and economic impact has been felt incredibly hard. Australia isn't the only place to feel the impact of increasing pressure on limited water resources. This is a picture we took when I ran through Burgundy in France, and I spoke to the vineyards who were telling me that water restrictions have reached into some of the most famous wine growing regions in the world, like this one. And in places like California, farmers like Mike Seeley, pictured here, have been told to rip out acres of the hard-fought-for orange plants that they've been growing since they were kids in order to reduce drain on overstressed underground water aquifers. This is real people in real places. I ran to the Aral Sea and I witnessed what years of overuse of water from the river system to grow cotton and rice have caused, and the devastation that has been reaped in this area. The Aral Sea has lost 90% of its size. This is a image of the Aral Sea today. It used to be covered in water and it is much smaller. I think it's easy to think that all of these issues belong to rural communities or small cities somewhere on the other side of the world, but the reality is that global supply chains mean that water issues in one place actually affect all of us and in different places as well. And here's how. Water goes into everything we use, we buy, and we consume every single day, from the food we eat to the clothes that we wear. Just taking this as an example, what you're wearing today took more water to make than all the water you've drunk in your whole lifetime. Just one outfit. And as our population increases, so does our demand for water. So much so, as Colin mentioned, the gap between demand and supply in the next 10 years is forecast to reach 56%. I think for me, this is actually a really key number because it demonstrates just how big this water problem is. These facts are completely staggering, but what's even more staggering and more impactful is that in many cases, the solutions are available. What's missing is the money and the political will to implement them. In Australia's case, 80% of the water savings can be generated in agriculture, changes that amount to a total of about 60% of the total cost of closing the gap for us. We can solve our water issues in Australia with a less than 1% of our GDP, less than 1% to achieve full delivery of sustainable water management. It's feasible, it's realistic, it just needs to be properly prioritised. But it's not prioritised. So how do we fix this? And for me, a big part of the conversation I think we need to have is talking about how do we prioritise, what is our future, and how do we find the solutions that we need? I think we continue to need public-facing campaigns to push water up the political and corporate agenda. But we also need to find a way to leverage investors and capital markets to help mobilise the technology and the solutions on the ground. This is bigger than numbers on a page. This is real people and real lives, but it's also about real opportunities. So I think that the question I'd like to leave and to pass on to Andrew, since Colin has created a very good system of passing questions down the line, is, Andrew, right now we see capital markets that are slow to move on water. I've witnessed problems around the world that could be solved if the capital markets came to the table. How can we find ways to increase the incentives to invest in this sector so that we can scale at a speed and at a rate that is sufficient to help to close this 56% water gap? Back to you, Anthony.
Great, thank you, Mina. Fascinating as ever. I do love the way you really do take it down to the ground level and show us how water scarcity is affecting people and businesses across the world. Now, Andrew, welcome. We're going to do a sort of a mix of a Q&A, question and answer, but also I think, Andrew, you've got a couple of thoughts you prepared as well. So let me just dive in. I know we've got a couple of thoughts from Mina and Colin for you, but let's step back a bit and just remind everyone here that UBS Global Wealth Management has made water scarcity one of its big investment themes for the decade. Can we just step back a bit? What made the firm do that? What was it that made you identify that? Because as I think, as we've already mentioned earlier, Mina mentioned, I mentioned earlier, there are many things that can take up our attention, especially when it comes to sustainability issues, climate change issues, and obviously with the hat you wear as head of sustainable and impact investing, you must get inundated with all manner of different ideas and requests for investment. So how did you come up with water scarcity as an investing theme, and how does that fit into your overall approach of investment?
So it's a great question, and thanks to Mina and Colin for setting up the conversation so well with all of that data. I mean, I think, to respond to what you said, I think water scarcity is one of those topics that for us, is a long-term investment theme, something that filters across portfolios. It really sits at the intersection of two of the areas that we see as significant for investors from our perspective in the Chief Investment Office, in our capacity, advising private individuals or private capital how to invest for the long term. And the two kind of areas that I would call out are, what you talked about, sustainable and impact investing. And then separately, our view that investors, although there are many short-term things in the market that need to be responded to tactically, investors need to guide their portfolios through long-term investment positioning. And so, if I think about long-term investments just at a high level, our analyst team, and you can see here on the slide, I'm not going to talk through everything in ultra granular detail, nor provide, individual recommendations, but we have two resources here that are listed on the slide that reflect websites that you can go to for further information, but they really do reflect those two areas. So it's longer term investments and how those affect portfolios, and also sustainable investing, and how that affects investor mindset and positioning as well. From a long-term investment positioning perspective, I would just say that the lens that we and our analyst team look through is the three key drivers that contribute to long-term investment positioning. So think about aging, population growth, and urbanization. And as these three drivers play out over kind of multi-year, multi-decade timeframes, they're going to drive opportunities for investors in a number of different areas. We have 25 or so long-term investment themes, of which one is water scarcity. Others include things like clean air and carbon reduction, energy efficiency, waste management and recycling, which are all distinct, but as Mina alluded to, all integrally interrelated, and so water scarcity is one of those things that we think about from an investor's perspective, a scarce resource that ultimately affects the input costs for a number of industries, and then is a very real cost on the ground, as Mina pointed out. So from a long-term investment perspective, important, and that's why it plays into our decade ahead positioning. The other trend that's out there is really sustainable investing, right? Increasingly, I think we're all aware that private capital is looking to incorporate sustainability considerations into the investment portfolios, right? So shifting away from just pure conventional that ignores, what in the past we've viewed as non-financial considerations, or has been oriented towards more of a values-aligned approach, and much more towards sustainability themed, selecting topics like water and other opportunities that are opportunities as well as risks. And so you have asset owners that are starting to move this into their portfolio, and at the far end of the spectrum, really focusing on themes like water, broader resource security, and scarcity issues, and understanding how they play into portfolios overall. And so, whether you look at, as an asset owner, a framework like the UN SDGs, right, or whether you look at specific themes like water or water-related challenges, these are things that you can increasingly integrate into your portfolio. So at a high level, I would say across asset classes in portfolios, what we see are opportunities, within each of the areas. It's typically not something where people would say, I have a water-focused portfolio, or water is the theme within my portfolio. But it's something that people are thinking about just as, they might think about climate, incorporating into the portfolio. So we start with the very conventional parts of people's portfolios in individual equities. What you look for is either pure play business models that are focused on water and water management. Water utilities tend to be fewer and farther between, and not something you necessarily have across your equity portfolio. But increasingly also looking at how companies perform on water efficiency. And the data is certainly getting better. It's not perfect, but it's getting better with regard to being able to evaluate which companies and entities are performing better from that perspective. But these are more one-off than anything. It's harder to find many pure plays within a portfolio, even when you look globally. But that's the way that that we tend to look at it in equity space. Fewer pure play active managers that have investment vehicles in the public space that are focused on this, although there are a few. In the bond space, many investors, and we've advised people to look at, municipal bonds where you look at use of proceeds and they're oriented towards facilities or infrastructure that is directly or indirectly related to water. So that's a nice opportunity also in the green bond space more broadly across a range of issuers. And then finally in the private equity or alt space, where you are starting to see as a component of strategies, again, fewer pure play vehicles, but a component of strategies where whether it's water infrastructure, wastewater management, or even products and services that, from a technological perspective, play into improvement of processes from an efficiency standpoint. This is increasingly a theme that we see embedded within some private equity portfolios because of the recognition of the importance of water. So maybe that's just a quick overview. It is available across portfolios. If I think about Colin's question about, how to utilize some of the data that he's come up with, to optimize or better inform capital allocation across portfolios, I still think that's tougher, to be honest. I think, optimization across a portfolio, it's always about risk and return, especially in pure investment portfolios. If we don't move into the kind of more catalytic or public or philanthropic capital area. And so I still think it's tougher to use it for optimization, but it's certainly an input, as I was describing earlier, into investment decisions across pieces of individual portfolios. Maybe I'll pause there for a second, Anthony.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So, the one thing that I think you partly addressed this, one thing that's always, I suppose, bothered me about how to invest in water in general is the lack of obvious pure play opportunities. So, as you mentioned, you've got certain companies that are in the water space as service providers looking at, say, sorting out wastewater issues or issues in agriculture. So, I'm thinking, Veolia, Xylem, companies like that. Or like you mentioned, there are, of course, water utilities, and often that would be going in through the bond or green bond space, as you mentioned, although there are some in America and some around the rest of the world that are public companies, which you can buy on the stock exchange. But I suppose it almost sort of gets into the point of, okay, you can go after companies, you can look at investing in companies where they're doing a good job. So, if it's in consumer products, let's say, or beverages. So, I know AB InBev talks a good game on this, Coca-Cola, Pepsi. Or you go after companies that I suppose are at the beginning of the journey of understanding that they need to increase their ability to show that their water game is a good one. But that's almost getting you into, to an extent, getting you into activism, isn't it, as a shareholder? If you start going down that route, I mean, it's a tricky decision you've got to start making.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think engagement is a key mechanism, right, to and this isn't specific to water, right? I mean, this is many kind of sustainability oriented issues where, you've started to see the intersection between, these issues and either top line revenue opportunities or bottom line profitability. And so as you start to see that and you start to see a clear differentiation in terms of who's performing well on let's say water related issues and who's not, just as you have investor collaboratives like Climate Action 100 Plus, right? There's an opportunity to surface, water related issues as well and point out or encourage those who are not performing well on the water issue to perform better, particularly when there's a link to, profitability and why one as a long-term investor would want to hold those securities. So I would put it more as engagement than activism, but I think there's definitely an opportunity for that in public market space.
So if we go back to Mina's question to you, what needs to change, do you think? How can we get investors or investment dollars to be put more to use in water? I think obviously there's big infrastructure projects as you talked about, although I note actually that green infrastructure projects often cost a lot less, can also reduce emissions and can have quicker results. But those are often difficult to get into. So I think I look at, say, Chennai, I think there's certainly one example that I've heard of recently, but also looking in South Africa around Cape Town, I think the Nature Conservancy came up with this. Actually, has been helping out to show that if you replace the non-indigenous trees around the area, you can actually improve the amount of water by 20-30%, I think it was, or maybe it was, you could get 20 or 30% of the water that was otherwise being lost that would have helped during the drought. These are great ideas. It increases water availability, but aren't necessarily obvious and direct investments you can make that yield a quick or even longer term financial return. They may be better for society and play through that way, but that's harder for you guys to capture, isn't it? As a straight up investment, you can say, here's how we've got that financial return. Even, and what's the number I've seen from the UN and others? Every dollar invested in water, you get a $6 return, but it's a very socialized profit, which is very hard to grasp as an investor. So how do you get over that hump, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's bringing it back to, for the investment piece of a portfolio where you're looking for market type of returns, it's surfacing what are the investment opportunities and why are they, financially attractive over long periods of time from a performance perspective. And I think, it's perhaps people aren't as aware of some of the, the opportunities in related industries, right? So I think on one of Mina's slides, she showed, well, it was ag that she talked about, and also I think on one of the slides there was, clothing and fast fashion and the water intensity of producing, things like leather, for example, or what went into the mobile phone, right? That the individual on the slide was holding. And so I think it's creating a recognition for investors that there are opportunities to generate financial return as well as improve, create real visible outcomes on the water issue. And so I think ag that was mentioned is really one of those opportunities, right? And so that's something that's very tangible, and yet it's also very investable, right? From a returns perspective, perhaps not as much on a pure play basis in the public space, but if you look at whether it's technological improvements that help support the efficiency of ag, whether it's innovations like vertical farming or other farming efficiency where you can take out water usage relative to traditional farming, and just the overall shift to alternatives, in the food space that support lower meat diets, reduce the water burden of all the food that we consume, over time, even if we're not actively shifting our consumption pattern. I think these are some things that are related, that clearly can remove water from the system, or water usage from the system, reduce water usage within the system.
Yeah, but let's bring Mina and Colin back in here as well. So Colin, one thing that I noticed when you were talking about agriculture, of course, was drip irrigation. And I just throw this out there because yes, drip irrigation can help reduce the scarcity gap. But also, there's one example I was given by someone who's coming up with a new irrigation technique, and he showed me how it works. Showed me some slides of how it worked in Arizona, I think it was, which of course is on the Colorado River, where there's a huge amount of water scarcity. And he said, so the farmer who was growing alfalfa introduced it, got a much better yield in his one particular area of the farm he was growing alfalfa in. I said, well, what did he do next? He said, well, he expanded his alfalfa growing to a larger part of his farm because he had more water. And I said, but doesn't that kind of miss the point that they really should be finding better uses for the water, where in Arizona, that's not what you want to be doing really, but from a short-term perspective, it makes economic sense. So there has to be not just technology and innovation there, but also, I think as Andrew was mentioning, also a recognition that certain practices need to change, that maybe growing water-intensive crops. I think I saw a figure the other day, half of the Colorado River water is used to grow feed for 5% of America's cattle, which is nuts in many respects, but you can't really go to a farmer and say, stop doing that right now because it's bad for water. I mean, economically, it's a very difficult thing to do. So that's a big issue to get around, isn't it, Colin?
Yes. You're giving me the hard stuff.
Absolutely.
So, absolutely. Technology solutions are, they're something that are useful, but they need to be put within a larger framework of changing the way that we manage, and it could be regulatory, it could be otherwise, but the way we relate to water, both economically and socially. I actually am of the opinion that from a technological perspective, we have everything that we need to solve all water-related issues today. Like we don't need technological advancements. And your example, Jevons paradox is the name of that type of problem, but it's very common within the water space. What I would say is the implementation of technical solutions that on that individual level for this individual farmer need to be complemented by, it could be national, it could be state, I would say policy initiatives that try and make sure that it could be, the US West is also a very complex problem because of the way the markets work. And I would say that generally speaking, implementing technology on an individual level needs to be complemented by some sort of governmental prioritization of water policy. What exactly that looks like, because that's a pretty generic phrasing, really needs to be determined on a local level. So I can't give you specifics because there's so many different types of specifics too. But I would say, yeah, you need that. And that's exactly why, if you think back to that, think back to our big breakdown, that global pie chart, 17% goes towards water management. Traditionally speaking, if we think about that pie chart, water access, sanitation, and hygiene do get a lot of attention and funding. Water scarcity is something that is understood but underfunded. Pollution is something that sometimes gets funded, but water management is, I would say, the part that most people tend to forget about. And this is not even accounting for the fact that the amount of debt that water utilities in the US are already under. So that was one of the things that we tried to highlight of, hey, look, even if you implement all of these solutions, you can't fix all of the problems just with technology solutions. You need to be putting it within a larger policy and regulatory framework, which is why we created that water management cost.
Right, excellent. And Andrew, just on that point, I know I gave a somewhat extreme example on what was happening in Arizona, but is there, would that be would an investor be able to say, look, we will invest in certain projects, ideas, whatever, or even in a particular company, if we also see some change? And I know it gets back to the engagement aspect there. And again, I'm not quite sure that an investor like UBS could actually get farmers to change their behavior necessarily, but do you see a role for that to actually, rather than just you going in, engaging with a public company, but you could actually start tying behavior to the money you invest in general, whether it's in private markets, for example?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it is increasingly possible to tie, incentives to the things that you as an investor want beyond just returns. So I think it's definitely possible. I think you have to think about all of the different players that are involved and whether, you can set up incentive the systems appropriately, or whether, someone was asking a question about public-private opportunities, and I think that's a dynamic that certainly plays in. So yeah, I think it's possible, but I think that there's no blanket solution, right? I think it's very much on a situation by situation basis.
And Mina, if we get to the situation on the ground in Australia, obviously we just mentioned policy responses in general. What are we seeing out of Australia at the moment, whether it's on the federal level or the state level, that either gives you hope or gives you concern? So, whether it's anything, as you mentioned in your talk about the lack of enough tree and plant cover to help filter the water. That is a big issue. What do we do about that? How do you see government responding to that and other issues as a result of the fires and the drought? And now, of course, the floods, which you're all getting.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to take a bit of a different perspective to both Colin and Andrew, because I think it's incredibly dangerous for us to sit back and wait for policy response. Policy makers, and we see this in Australia, we've seen it in the United States, we've seen it in climate change, and we're seeing it in water. Policy makers are the last responders. They're the ones that sit with their hand permanently on the snooze button until they're forced to get out of bed and do something about an issue. And I think from an investment perspective, waiting until they do that means you lose an opportunity to deliver significant financial returns, but also deliver something meaningful and impactful to local communities. We've talked, and Colin and Andrew have both talked about agriculture. As we've discussed, it is one of the biggest areas of potential for change, both from delivering water savings and also for delivering financial returns. So in the agricultural sector in a country like Australia and in the United States, we still have open channel and flood-based irrigation instead of drip irrigation. We are looking in many cases at opportunities to deploy, for example, drip irrigation at scale. We're also looking for opportunities to deliver more crop per drop of water. And in that, it's not just about technology in drip irrigation, it's also about thinking outside the box, delivering the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution into agriculture. So drones and different sensors and technology that can be deployed, but even on a really simple level, looking at some of the GMO crops. So in Australia, up in the Narrabri region, which has been fraught with drought and where farmers have spent the last 3-4 years missing their planting because there's been no water to actually plant the cotton that they need. We have some of the best cotton seed in the world. It is GMO, but it is delivering very, very substantial above average returns to farmers because it is such high quality. So I think that we need to think about solutions and opportunities in the water space that is far beyond policy and is definitely requires us as investors and potential investees to actually step up to the plate and say, here is the raft of opportunity, here is how we can deliver a financial return, and let's actually make that happen without sitting back and waiting for policymakers to make the change first.
Yeah, Andrew, if I throw it back to you now, and there's also a question on about this as well. I know you mentioned Climate Action 100 Plus, which obviously is going after the top, I think the top 160 greenhouse gas emitters. The question we've got from one of the members of the audience is there a role for a similar kind of investment group to look at water? That one's for you, Andrew, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think there is. You know, to respond to the question, we're not actively engaged on anything, creating anything specific around that yet. But I think there's certainly a role for that as people recognize the value of engagement, and certainly among the public company space. So yes, but I think Mina's point is a good one, which is there's a lot more that's needed beyond just what's happening in public company space. And so I think that's one component of it. But yeah, nothing as of yet, but I think that there's definitely the potential for that.
Right. Excellent. Right, well, look, guys, we're coming up on time, so I know it's a busy day, so I'm going to let you guys all go. Firstly, I'd like to thank Colin and the team at WRI for helping to organize this. Mina, thank you so much for staying up late, getting up early, choose your poison, to come and talk to us as well. And Andrew, thanks so much for your insights. It's actually great to have this mix of finance, data, and on-the-ground experience. I think it's something that we too often lack in a lot of these conversations about water. It's great to have the three of you together to discuss it. So thanks very much again. If you want any more information, certainly from Breaking Views perspective, we've got a whole raft of stories on water, which we list on the slide at the end. I think we put it in the invite to you guys as well. bv-water.com, you can find it. And we've got Colin's information at the end as well. And any other questions, please feel free to get in touch. And as I think we said earlier, we will be passing this on to everyone in the form of both a recording and also the slides as well. So Mina, Andrew, and Colin, thanks very much. Great to speak to you.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks all for tuning in. Speak to you all soon.